Hi there, welcome to the 6th week of Anatomy at SI. We're here with the lab models again, and I want to talk about the appendicular muscles. And so first, we're going to start with the muscles of the anterior thorax in section 1. So for the muscles of the anterior thorax, let's go ahead and start kind of looking at this anterior view of our thorax in abdominal space. And so for the first muscle that I want you to know, that's the pectoralis minor. We've all heard of the pec major, right? The pectoralis major, that's this large muscle right here. It's the muscle that we all see on like the big bodybuilders and stuff, right? If we took off the pec major, right, we would have the pec minor. The pectoralis minor is this multiple load muscle that attaches onto the ribs, and it's just underneath the pectoralis major. The next one that I want you to know is the serratus anterior. The serratus anterior is going to be on the side, just underneath the pectoralis minor, right? And these are deep muscles, right? Here's the serratus anterior. The serratus anterior kind of look like serrated, like a serrated knife, right? If you see bodybuilders, they'll have like those striations or serrations kind of here underneath their ribs. And that's exactly what those muscles are. That's that serratus anterior. And they actually wrap all the way around, right? So they're going to wrap, as you can see, from the ribs right here all the way around to the back and attach onto the inferior border of the scapula. And so that's kind of how those muscles are attaching on there, and they help with inspiration and exhalation. All right, let's look at the subclavius. So sub meaning beneath, right? And then clavicle, clavius. If we look just underneath the clavicle, there's a little tiny muscle called the subclavius. It sits just underneath the clavicle. If we look at it up all together, the subclavius sits just beneath the clavicle right there. Hopefully you can see that muscle. Okay, see that up in there? Subclavius, just beneath the clavicle. Okay, now that we've done that, let's go ahead and move on to some of the muscles of the posterior thorax. So, okay, there we go. Hopefully you can see this okay. So I've got the muscles of the posterior thorax first. We've got the trapezius. And I like these because they're kind of named after shapes, and a lot of them are kind of shaped for, or kind of shaped like the shape that they're named for. So the first one is the trapezius. The trapezius is kind of named for a trapezoid, and we can see it. It's this muscle right here, right? And it's this entire muscle stretching all the way up to the top of the head, right? Or sorry, to the bottom of the head, originating on those nuchal lines, right? The superior nuchal lines, and then inserting down onto the spine down here, and also inserting in onto the spine of the scapula. The trapezius is a large muscle, and it's a superficial back muscle. It helps to kind of hold on to this, hold our arm and pull back like this motion, you know, like we were rowing or something. So we've got the trapezius. Next, we've got the levator scapulae. The levator scapulae is awesome because it's named for exactly what it does, right? It elevates the scapula. I love it. And if we look, I'm going to put this scapula back on the body. All right, so we've got the arm. And if we look, there's only one muscle really attaching to the top of the scapula, right, to the superior border, and that would pull it up for a shrug. And that's this muscle right here. It actually originates up on our vertebrae, up here, right, up on our cervical vertebrae, and then attaches down here onto the superior border of the scapula, and it helps to elevate the scapula, right? Levator scapula. It's named for exactly what it does. I love that one for that reason. All right. So we've got the levator scapula down. Let's talk about the rhomboid major and the rhomboid minor. And these muscles are very interestingly named because the minor is going to be this smaller one up here, right? Oh, my fingers are in the way. This smaller one right here. Can you see that okay? That small muscle is the rhomboid minor. Just beneath it, this whole muscle right here is the rhomboid major. Notice how the major is bigger, but it is inferior to the minor, which is right here. Rhomboid minor, rhomboid major. Okay, we've got the rhomboids down. Let's go ahead and talk about the muscles that cross the shoulder joint. So the first one that's going to cross over the shoulder joint is going to be that pec major, right? So if I take my, that sounded important. Let me go ahead and take this off. And if we look at the pec major, we see that it's attaching onto the onto kind of the sternum, right? And then stretching up over and wrapping around. I wish I had another arm over here, but it's helping to wrap around that arm, right? Helping to wrap and form that kind of muscle cage that helps lock our the head of the humerus in for the glenohumeral joint. And so the pectoralis major is part of that whole system, and that's right here. We all know the pec major. The next one that we should know is the latissimus dorsi. I'm sure everybody has done a lat pull down or heard of it, right? Or if you've gone swimming, you've also used your latissimus dorsi quite extensively. Well, the latissimus dorsi is going to be this whole muscle right here. It's this giant back muscle, right? Attaches all the way along here and inserts up inside the arm. And it inserts onto the humerus. And so when we do a lat pull down, right, we grab the bar and we pull down like this, and that latissimus dorsi is going to, oops, there's a desk there, it's going to fire and then cause it to pull down like that, right? Or if we're swimming, it's also going to pull back with that latissimus dorsi. The latissimus dorsi is also called the swimmer's muscle for that reason, right? It's super important for that motion. But that is the latissimus dorsi. Back on the model, it's this whole muscle right here. Okay. So we've done latissimus dorsi. Let's talk about the deltoid. The deltoid is kind of an interesting muscle, and it's super easy for us to find on ourselves and on the model. It is not as easy to put back on the model as it is to take off. So if we have the arm, right, we just have this giant shoulder muscle. You can feel it on yourself too. It's this big bulbous muscle right here. That's your deltoid muscle, and it helps in assisting with that motion, help kind of abducting our arm up and away from our body. Okay, cool. That's the deltoid muscle. Let's talk about the coracobrachialis. This is another muscle that's named really well for its location. There's a couple of those that creep in through here, and make sure you're paying attention to where those are at. But for the coracobrachialis, it might be easier if we take the arm off. We've got the arm right here. This is the anterior arm. I've taken off the biceps, so we're looking at some of the deeper arm muscles. This is the brachialis right here, right? This muscle right here is going to be the coracobrachialis. It attaches on the coracoid process up here and attaches down onto the brachial region of the humerus, right? So we call it the coracobrachialis. Coracobrachialis. Okay. With the coracobrachialis, it's important to note that, just remember that it's attaching onto the coracoid process up here, and remember that the coracoid process is on the scapula, right? Okay. Let's talk about the muscles of let's talk about the teres major first. So, if I flip this arm around, this is the posterior view, right? This would be like if I was looking at the arm from this angle, okay? Taking it off. This is the teres major. The teres major is larger than the teres minor, and the teres major is actually going to insert onto the humerus. So it inserts onto the humerus. Importantly, it is not a muscle of the rotator cuff. This muscle right here, not part of the rotator cuff. It's called the teres major, and it's not a part of the rotator cuff. However, let's talk about the rotator cuff muscles, which are extremely important. And the reason why they're important is because the head of our humerus almost sits on this flat socket. That's the glenohumeral cavity. And if we took all these muscles off, our arm would it'd fall off. There's literally nothing kind of keeping it in there. It doesn't slot in like some of our other bones do, right? That humerus is really only held in by the bones that are kind of wrapping around to suck it back in and keep it from leaving its fossa, right? That glenoid cavity. So the teres major is not contributing to that action. It's not wrapping all the way around. Let's go ahead and take off the deltoid because it kind of obscures some of these muscles. But the teres major is not going to wrap all the way around. Let's go ahead and look at some of the actual rotator cuff muscles that are helping form that shoulder cavity. The first one is the supraspinatus. So remember the spine of the scapula, right? That's a structure that we all have to know for one of our first couple labs. And that's this right here, right? That's the spine of the scapula. And if I want to know kind of where some of these muscles are, just need to follow the language, right? Follow the etymology. Or entomology, that's insects. Etymology, that's words. Awesome, let's do it. Supraspinatus. Supraspinatus is going to be up here, right? Supraspinatus, here's the spine, so it's this muscle, supra, above the spine. It sits in the supraspinous fossa. The supraspinatus sits in the supraspinous fossa of the scapula. Okay. Then if we've got a supraspinatus, we also have to have a infraspinatus. Yes, here's the infraspinatus. It's all of this multi-lobed muscle, right? And it's importantly going to be below that spine, right? Below it, right? And the next one that we should know is the teres minor. The teres minor is this muscle right here, and it's just beneath that infraspinatus. Here's the infraspinatus again. There's that teres major, or sorry, teres minor. Teres minor is again a part of that rotator cuff, whereas the teres major down here, not part of the rotator cuff. Teres minor is, teres major is not. Okay, the last one that we need to know is the subscapularis. So I took this whole thing, flipped it around. Now we're looking at a deep view of the scapula, right? We're looking at the subscapular fossa. This is the kind of the interior portion or up, right? If I pulled my whole scapula up, we'd be looking at the inside of it. And the subscapularis is going to be this multi-lobed muscle right here that sits in the subscapular fossa, attaching all along that medial border. Okay, that's all of section 1. Let's go ahead and dive into section 2. That's going to be the muscles crossing the elbow joint. So for the first muscle that crosses the elbow joint, let's go ahead and talk about the triceps brachii. The triceps brachii, tri meaning 3, has 3 muscle bellies. All right, if we look at the first belly right here, that's the first one. First belly, second belly right there, and then we've got the last belly right here. Those are going to be all 3 bellies of that triceps that help us extend our arm out, right? The next muscle that we have is the aconius. The aconius is going to be this smaller muscle up on our forearm right there, and it kind of wraps right next to that triceps, which is right here, right? There's that aconius, a little bit smaller, right? And and if you work out like quite a bit with this motion here, you can get to the point of where it's pretty easy to see that little tiny aconius just kind of popping out, like popping out. And it's kind of harder to see unless you're really working out, just because it's a smaller muscle. But if we look on the model, we can see our aconius is going to be this little muscle right there. Okay. Next, let's look at the biceps brachii. Biceps brachii is I feel like everybody's seen the biceps brachii before, and we're all pretty familiar with it, but let's look at it on the model too. So this is now an anterior view of the arm, right? There's the thumb. We look right here. This is the biceps brachii. Bi meaning 2, it's got 1 and 2 muscle bellies, right? Biceps brachii. If we take off the biceps brachii, underneath, deep to the bicep, there's the brachialis muscle. The brachialis is actually the primary flexor of our arm, right? This is the primary flexor, whereas the bicep is assisting with that and then also performing supination. All right. Next, we've got the brachioradialis, and the brachioradialis is going to kind of wrap around from the brachial region over the radius. So that's this muscle right here, and it wraps all the way around, up and inserting up onto the wrist like that. That's the brachioradialis. Okay, now that we talked about those, let's go ahead and talk about the anterior muscles of the forearm. The first one that the first set that we'll talk about are the superficial, or like the superficial set. And it's kind of easier to envision these muscles if you think about them in layers. So this is kind of our first superficial layer, okay? First one is pronator teres. Pronator teres is going to be this muscle right here, and it inserts all the way up over on which muscle, or which bone does it actually insert onto, Jacob?
Radius.
The radius. So yes, if we look at the pronator teres, it's inserting down onto the radius, and when that muscle fires, it's going to help us perform that pronating motion, right? That palm down, pronation. We either hold soup or we fight for our nation, right? Soup, supination, nation, pronation. The pronator teres helps with that pronation, that's palm down. All right. So we've got pronator teres, that's this muscle right here. Next, we've got the flexor carpi radialis, and it's doing exactly what it says it's doing, right? I know that sounds kind of funky, but bear with me. It's going to flex the carpals, and it sits atop the radius. So here we've got the flexor carpi radialis, right? It's going to help us flex some, I think it's do you remember which digits it flexes? I don't remember which
Does it
digits it
flex
flexes
the
either.
digits?
It doesn't flex the digits. That's
Just the
okay.
wrist.
But it's helping to flex the wrist, right? If we think flexor carpi, we've got the carpal bones right up in here. Got myself confused. Carpal bones right there. That flexor carpi radialis is going to help pull and flex up the whole wrist, right? That's this muscle right here. Okay, so we've got the flexor carpi radialis. Next, we're going to go palmaris longus. Palmaris longus is going to run all the way down into the palm, right? Palmaris longus, it's named very well because it runs all the way down into that palm. It's very long, right? And the last one is that flexor carpi ulnaris, which is going to be down on this side, and it runs along the ulna to kind of help with that, or to kind of help flex the pinky side of our hand, right? So, flexor carpi ulnaris down over here. And that's all of the superficial anterior muscles of the forearm. Next, we've got the deep ones. For the first deep anterior muscle of the forearm, we've got the flexor digitorum superficialis. That's going to be this muscle that's actually underneath all of those superficial muscles that we were talking about. If I pull this part of the model off, we can see this whole muscle right here. Okay, this whole muscle right here is going to be the flexor digitorum superficialis. Next, we've got the flexor digitorum profundus, which is going to be just down beneath. And again, flexor digits, right? Flexing the digits. Flexor digitorum profundus is going to be this muscle right here. Flexor digitorum profundus. Next, we've got the pronator quadratus, which we can't actually see on this model. The pronator quadratus is going to be a horizontal muscle that's just underneath the wrist, and it helps us kind of with that twisting motion of our wrist, right? Just down in here, and it's helping to hold in those carpals. All right. And lastly, we've got the flexor pollicis longus. Pollicis means thumb, right? Poly, or pollicis meaning thumb. Flexor, we're going to flex the thumb with this long muscle, and that's this muscle right here, flexor pollicis longus. Alrighty. Now let's go ahead and talk about the posterior muscles of the forearm. So if we're looking anteriorly, let's go ahead and flip to the back. Now we're looking at the posterior view of this arm. First, we've got the extensor carpi radialis longus. The extensor carpi radialis longus is going to be, Jacob, mind helping me point this one out really fast? I'm kind of having trouble finding it. Ah, yes, right there.
Right.
So,
brachioradialis, and then
yes,
right there.
Yeah, so I got myself tripped up. A lot of these muscles look the same, and you can remember where the extensor carpi radialis longus is because it's right next to that brachioradialis. So here's the brachioradialis, right? And then right next to it is that extensor carpi radialis longus running just along the radius, right? So we've got the extensor carpi radialis. Next, we've got the extensor digitorum. The extensor digitorum is going to be this muscle right here, and it helps us to extend our digits, right? Extensor digitorum. And last, we've got the, looks like extensor carpi ulnaris. That's going to be this muscle right here. And it helps us to kind of extend these help us extend the last couple fingers that we have, right? That pinky and then the ring finger just down there. That's that extensor carpi ulnaris. All right, so we're finishing up with the deep muscles of the posterior forearm. And these ones are kind of hard to see and they're kind of hard to remember, but Jacob has a really good way for us to look at it. So let's go ahead and dive into the model and kind of take a stab from there. So looking at, again, the posterior view, we've got the pinky right here and the thumb over here. That makes this bone the ulna and this bone the radius. The first muscle that we're going to look at is the extensor indicis, and it's pretty hard to see, but it's this tiny little muscle right here that's attaching onto the ulna, okay? And that extensor indicis is going to help us extend out our index finger. Importantly, all of these deep extensors are going to run from the ulna to the radius, as I name them, right? We're running from the ulna over to the radius. So I've got the extensor indicis right here, the extensor pollicis longus, which is this kind of buried muscle right there. You can barely see it, right? Just above that extensor indicis. There's the extensor pollicis longus, and it dives down through the hand and attaches all the way up at the tip of our thumb to help us extend it out, right? Super long, that's why we call it the extensor pollicis longus. Next, we've got the extensor pollicis brevis, which is going to be this muscle right here. The extensor pollicis brevis is a little bit shorter than the longus, even though it doesn't quite look like it, right? And that's because it's only attaching to that second joint up here. And you don't need to know that, don't even need to know what the joint is or how it's working, but all you need to know is that this brevis is shorter than the longus, which is right here. So we've got the extensor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis right there. All right. And for the last two muscles, we've got the abductor pollicis longus, and that's going to be this larger muscle right at the end. Remember how we went from the ulna to the radius? We went extensor indicis, extensor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis brevis, and then abductor pollicis longus, right? And that attaches all the way, and that is over here kind of on the radius, right? Attaching onto the ulna, gliding over the radius, and then helping to extend out and abduct the thumb. All right, for the last muscle, we're gonna talk about the supinator. The supinator is this muscle right here, and it helps us perform that supination motion. So remember, we have the pronator teres, which is doing this motion. Now we've got the supinator, which is going to help us pull our palm up, right? Supination, that's palm up. And that's going to be performed by this muscle right here, the supinator of our posterior forearm. Okay, so that concludes all of part 1 of the appendicular muscles. I'll go ahead and try to have a video for appendicular muscles part 2 uploaded kind of later after spring break. But for the time being, reach out if you have any questions, and good luck on your quiz.